Hey, welcome to Transform Your Workplace, the podcast where we dive into the ideas, strategies, and conversations that help you build a better work environment. I'm your host, Brandon Laws, and whether you're a leader trying to build culture, a manager navigating team dynamics, or someone who just wants to do better work, this show is for you. And before we get into today's episode, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Xenium HR. Look, if you run a business, you know the drill. Every payroll question leads to 5 more HR questions. You've got vendors scattered everywhere who don't talk to each other, and suddenly you're the one managing all of it. That's time you don't have, time that should be spent growing your business. Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution brings everything under one roof. HR management, payroll administration, even benefits if you need it. All supported by a dedicated team that actually knows your business. So if you're tired of piecing it all together, check out Xenium HR at xeniumhr.com. Okay, let's get into today's episode. My guest is Jason F. McClennan, author of The Magic of Imperfection, the 3/4 Baked Secret to Unlocking Innovation and Getting More Done. And let me tell you, if you've ever found yourself obsessing over the last 10% of a project, like rewriting the same email 5 times or holding on to an idea because it's not quite ready, this conversation is going to hit home. Jason introduces this concept called the 3/4 baked philosophy. The idea is simple but kind of counterintuitive. Stop trying to perfect everything yourself. Get your work to the point where the intention is clear, then let others help you finish it. That's where the magic happens. In this episode, you'll learn why chasing fully baked actually hurts your output and your self-worth. We talk about how to calibrate your effort to match what's actually at stake, because not every task deserves the same intensity. Jason shares a concept from architectural training called the crit, where you pin up your work and let people tear it apart, and why that's actually a gift. And we dig into the difference between micromanaging and what he calls bird dogging, which is really caring enough to check in. So if you've ever felt stuck, burned out, or like you're getting in your own way, this episode will give you a fresh perspective and some practical tools to move forward. All right, let's get into it. Here is my conversation with Jason F. McClennan. Jason, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, my pleasure. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. I'm really excited to talk about your book. It's called The Magic of Imperfection, the 3/4 Baked Secret to Unlocking Innovation and Getting More Done. The book's doing well. You've won some awards. And I want to start at the very beginning of this idea because the title itself is going to be shocking for some of these perfectionist listeners that might be out there. So you write about this concept of mise en place. And this is a culinary idea of prepping ingredients. You compare the traditional way of working at home to cook, like dumping a bunch of ingredients together and hoping for the best, versus a chef who prepares all the ingredients, puts out the pasta, pulls it out half or 3/4 baked to finish in the sauce. So break down this idea for us, this 3/4 baked philosophy, and why this might be ripe for innovation.
Yeah, we were talking. I think that perfectionists in particular have a hard time with this concept, but they're the people that need it most. I think that everyone's familiar with the idea of something being half-baked. So the world is full of half-baked ideas, which ideas that we probably don't need in the world, ideas that are poorly thought through. But as a society, we have this sort of obsession with perfection, and people assume that means that they have to perfect it themselves, and they hold on to ideas for too long. They overcook things, they overbake things, and or they just don't get their ideas out in the world, which is a shame because there's a lot of brilliant people out there that have things that deserve to be out. So I've developed a whole philosophy that I do call the 3/4 baked philosophy of how do you get ideas out in the world more efficiently and have the universe help you, other people, the market, your peers, other people provide feedback and help you perfect it. So you take it only as a target to the 3/4 baked point in time. And if you really want perfection, that's the way you do it, not by holding on and overcooking it yourself too long. That's the idea, basically.
You share a quote at the beginning of chapter 1 from a French romantic artist, and the quote goes, "The artist who aims at perfection, everything achieves it in nothing." And that's in the end of the quote. And I see this often in organization where we see high performers burning out because they're constantly obsessing over that maybe last 10% of a project. And you mentioned that perfectionists are often fooling themselves and getting caught up in either their ego or self-doubt, self-critical feedback loop. How does chasing that fully baked state actually hurt our professional self-worth and output?
Yeah, it's funny how people do spend the majority of their time at sort of the last, sometimes 10, 20, 25% if you're sticking with what I talk about.
Right.
And they're not necessarily making it better. Sometimes people make things better, which is great, but most of the time we're fooling ourselves and we are, rewriting and rewriting, rehashing things, second guessing what we've done. And what we're really doing is we're stealing time away from ourselves, our loved ones. We're stealing time from the idea, which is a crime. And we're not letting other people co-create. We're not letting there be a process of getting feedback because we're so afraid to fail, and which is the underlying thing that is there, as people are worried because they attach their self-worth to their ideas so strongly. But what if it's not good enough? Or what if I don't get this right? Or what if? And what ends up happening at the end of a lot of projects, as you probably know, is as people hold on tighter and tighter, the work gets more constricted and we actually don't do good work anymore. And that's the irony of this perfectionist approach, is that we end up making our own genius, less great. And so learning to understand when you're starting to constrict your own innovation, your own genius, is a magical place. And that's part of the word magic in the title, and letting go and letting things stand on their own terms. And if failure comes, great, you'll learn from it. But and then you'll make it even better the next time.
So we already highlighted this 3/4 baked. It's the magic of imperfection, and fully baked is this imaginary elusive state. What are the 1/4 and half baked states? How would you describe those?
Yeah, and I'll even spend a little bit more time on the 3/4 baked side because there's a little bit more nuance to it. So again, half baked, I think people get. So that's an idea that is poorly thought through, where there's externalities or things people haven't thought of, like the consequences of an idea or a product or whatever it is. A quarter baked, more loosely, is when there really isn't a structure to the idea. It's a germ of an idea, and that can be important too. And we'll come back to that. You've mentioned fully baked is this elusive place, but 3/4 baked is for me a point in time when an idea has enough clarity that someone can understand what you're trying to accomplish. There's enough clarity and thought to it where it has form as an idea. And that's a great point in which to get feedback, because the intention is clear enough in theory that others can then contribute. And they can't do that at half baked, because where do you begin? Like, there's so many things wrong with it. And it doesn't really represent what you're trying to get at. It's only half baked, right? But trying to get it past 3/4 baked, that's when we start getting into those problems. It's amazing, though, that people spend so little of their time on getting feedback at the quarter baked moment. Like, let's test whether this idea, even has any legs. We don't do that enough. And then we hold on to things as long as we can to try to perfect it ourselves. And we blow past this amazing 3/4 baked moment. Lazy people just release thing at half baked and they're like, well, I'm done with it, But the genius, the magic, is in this 3/4 baked time period. That's a tough thing to teach.
Yeah. Well, and there's a good story that you shared in the book about Buckminster Fuller and the tensegrity dome. His students built this structure, a dome, and it collapsed instantly. They were devastated because it collapsed and they failed, but Fuller was thrilled because they found the breaking point in the dome. So for leaders listening, how do we build a culture where a project collapsing is seen as a necessary data point rather than a career-ending disaster? And I'm sure it, depending on the stakes, probably don't want massive failure, but maybe walk me through that.
Well, that's part of it, and the book does contain a couple of stories from Buckminster Fuller, and one of my great mentors, Bob Berkebile, was a student of Bucky Fuller's, and I've been tied in with the Bucky Fuller Institute as well. But yeah, so you had this moment where all these students were really dejected that they had built this great dome and it falls apart, and oh my God, we failed, and he instead said, "Yes, we did it." And we learned where our weakness was. We learned something critical. So, like we talked about, culturally, we teach students at a young age to really avoid failure at all costs. And we don't talk to them about calibrating that to the importance of something. So, by all means, if you are on the operating table as a heart surgeon, you want to avoid failure. You do. But most people work on things that are much less significant. And it's okay to have moments when things don't work out. And you do need to understand calibration. The problem is we haven't taught that in terms of people's internalization of an idea, and also how we reward people. We reward people only for successes. We punish them for failures. And our egos, we punish ourselves for failures, even if we learn something really amazing, like, oh my God, we just learned some incredible insight, but I still feel bad about it. So how messed up is that? So somehow what managers have to do is they have to start rewarding innovation, rewarding learnings, not just outcomes. And we need to give our teams tools in which to recognize this in ourselves so that we can see our work more objectively. We have to have people separate their own self-worth, their own ego from the things that they do enough that they actually can welcome failure as part of a process of getting closer to perfection. And that's part of the magic, is by welcoming failure, you get closer to perfection.
Let's talk about something that's super uncomfortable when shipping our work, and that's like the feedback loop of our work. You talk about this architectural concept called crit. I've never heard of this before. So you pin your work up on the wall, let people tear it apart. And you mentioned that when we hear feedback, we take it personal and get defensive, most of us, and their growth stops. How can managers help their teams separate their ego from their work so they can actually use this crit method and this three-force baked idea to enhance their work and make it the best possible?
Yeah, I think there are some lessons that any business manager can learn from architectural training. The process of a crit or criticism is like literally part of our education. Like, you got to learn to take it. And the idea is students have to pin up their work at different stages of its development. So not just at the end, and you do have to have a final, it's called a final crit, when your work as an architectural student is evaluated, but you have crits throughout the process, and those are even more important. And the idea is, like, you put up on the wall for your peers and your professors both to see, and you sit there, you present it. Hopefully it's at 3/4 baked at the various phases, might be half baked, and then they in front of you criticize the work. They're not criticizing you. Sometimes that happens, but it shouldn't. But the work is the work objectively, which is out there. You're here, the work's there, and it's being reviewed. That is really good training to go through, to, again, learn about separation and learn about getting feedback on things that you're putting out there. So that's really what the idea is. You can make this fun. You can make this humorous. It doesn't have to be like a crit. It doesn't have to be negative. It can be fun. It can be inspiring. And the best professors of architecture will get out their pen and draw on your drawings. So here you've spent hours and hours on something. It's like this sacred thing. They'll take your model and they'll rip the model up in front of you. You spent, 40 hours on it, and they're like, I think this part doesn't work. And they rip it off. And then they'll draw on your drawings. And that can be traumatic especially for new students, new to, like, if you studied in another discipline, because it's like, oh my God, you just wrecked my drawing. But no, you're holding it too precious. Someone with more experience is giving you an idea to consider, and whether you accept it or not, you should at least consider it.
I love the idea of the significance meter. I think it's an approach that every team needs. You write that a three-force baked effort for a critically important deadline is very different from one where the task is of minor importance. So how do we as leaders help employees calibrate their efforts so they aren't treating low stakes email, let's say, with the same intensity of a really important project?
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen colleagues burn out because they don't know how to shut it off. And the idea of calibration is important in the three-quarter baked philosophy. Again, I'm not at any point, I'm never suggesting putting out bad work. In fact, the whole point of this is in service to better work. But we do need to recognize, and the significance meter is a little tool in the book that's really where you ask yourself, like, how critical is this? Like, is this heart surgery, or is this like an important deadline, or is it like not even an important deadline? And that's not asked in an excuse to be lazy or to put out bad work, but it is about calibrating our efforts so that we have the reserves to do things that come up that might be more important, that might demand more of our time. And most people don't work on one deadline at a time. Some people's jobs are like that. But a lot of people have they got 10 things they got to do at one time. And those 10 things are never equal. And yet you have to have some sleep. You have to, spend time with your kids. So how do you begin to calibrate where you spend time and how much effort, and what three-quarter baked is changes. Like three-quarter baked to a critical mission is different than three-quarter baked to a email. And then yet there's people that will agonize over emails to their colleagues and like rewrite it 10 times and like, oh my God, just pick up the phone. Like, don't worry about it so much. And so that's really this idea. The significance meter is part of building an internal calibration sense so that you're spending your time wisely, not unwisely. You're saving your energy for when it really matters. And really, simple stuff, but really hard for many people to do,
I pulled out this quote, maybe somewhat controversial for some people or may hit people the wrong way, but you say, I would go a step further and say that whenever you accept a task, you now own its deadline. Even if you don't know what it is, it has one. End of the quote. So, but we often hear people say like, well, nobody told me when it was due. So why is setting a deadline, even if it's an artificial one, critical to this 3/4 baked process?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most frustrating things to a manager is when somebody says, I didn't know what the deadline was. Like, well, why did you ask? Or if you weren't clear, everything has a deadline and should. Even if it doesn't have an external deadline, you should give it a deadline because you need to know when to stop. It's lazy to not set a deadline. You have to have a point in time to develop anything that you're working on because life demands other things of us. And then once you have that deadline, you need to then work backwards from that time to where you are today and see, well, how much time do I even have to get this done? How do you begin to calibrate if you don't know where the end game is? So that's, it's something that I insist that people do is if you don't know what a deadline is for something, ask. If there is no one to ask, set one yourself and then work backwards from that. And sometimes you have to change a deadline, revise a deadline, but that's fine. That's different. And usually there is a deadline of people's expectations, even if they don't give you one. If you have a boss, there really is a deadline, guys.
Yeah, I love what you're saying because like if you make an agreement and you take on the task, then you need to own it. But whatever that date is, whether it's artificial far in the future or it's a hard deadline, we need to be in communication and maybe even renegotiate if you can't not meet that deadline. But either way, you're owning it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're being judged by somebody.
You use this metaphor in the book of momentum surfing, comparing it to how lactic acid builds up in the body during an exercise. And you say when momentum stalls, don't fight it. And that's hard for us to hear in the corporate world when we're like 9 to 5 grinding it out and, facing burnout. But what does momentum surfing look like in a practical day-to-day office environment?
Well, it is about working smarter, not harder. But sometimes it does mean working harder, and sometimes it means working less hard. Yeah, momentum surfing is an important concept in the book. And I find that generally the habits that people have undermine innovation and they undermine productivity. So I'll give you some examples that, like, for example, let's say you're writing a chapter or a report that you have that's due. And it's going really well. You can feel it. You're on this sort of path, and I just wrote a couple pages. It's going well. I think I'll take a break now, or I think now I'll check my email. And what happens is they're breaking their momentum. And it's unfortunate because they're breaking it when it's going well. And then other times now, like it's not going well. and they're grinding and they're pulling their hair out, and what they're doing is they're constricting, like they're getting more like, tight. And so now you get writer's block, and now you're like frustrated and it's really hard. And so, it's like, don't fight this stuff. The genius in getting a lot done is when things are working well, you ride that wave as far as you can. You cancel your meetings if you can. You don't check your email. You don't stop at 5 p.m. If you're on a roll, right to 7 p.m. if you can. Like, it's not 9 to 5. It's what is needed to get it done. And then the moment you hit a tough patch, that may actually be a 3/4 baked moment. That may be a moment that instead of grinding it out, you've taken it to that point. That's when you share it. That's when you walk across the aisle to your colleague and say, would you check this out? Would you give me feedback on this? I'm kind of stuck now, or I'm at a point where it's becoming hard again. Now you're going to take a break. Let your friend read it. And then when you have that dialogue, the momentum might start fresh again. But it's really understanding, not cutting off that moment of momentum and getting then stuck, paddling upstream. You want to always paddle with the current whenever you can. And it's amazing how much you get done. Like, you get way more done. It's crazy, in fact.
Hopefully I don't butcher the pronunciation of this, but you bring up this Taoist concept of wu-wei, or effortless action symbolized by water. You know that while we need systems, when there's a disproportionate amount of focus on process, it's easier for us to lose track of our goals. So how do we spot when our internal processes have solidified into stone and we need to become more like water again?
Well, I think most people have experience dealing with bureaucracy in some fashion, like and it's obviously big organizations. If you work for a university or a major corporation or any kind of entity that's been around a long time, that starts to develop a whole series of internal processes and forms you have to fill out and shit you got to do. And there's reasons for those things. There's reasons, and sometimes they're very good reasons, but it does tend to creep in where process starts to become more important than the thing that you're actually trying to achieve. And that's when there's a problem. And that's when innovation starts to decline, especially in large, complex organizations, big companies and organizations. They stop innovating. You wonder why, like the startup, the guys working out of their garage create the next big thing, because they're trying to figure out how to get something done, and they will change their process to get the thing done as nimbly as they can. The truth is that process is always in service, or should be in service, to an outcome. But when the process becomes more sacred to you than the thing you're trying to work on or thing you're trying to change, that's when you have a problem. So Wei Wu and this idea of effortless action only works when we don't let the process that we've developed become the sacred thing. We let the ideas flow around rather than right into, do this in triplicate.
Let's talk about end game thinking. Use this metaphor of two boats leaving harbor. And even if they're off by just a degree, they end up miles apart over time. You call this mission drift. And before a team starts baking anything, what are some alignment questions that we need to ask before we start heading in the same direction and not drifting apart?
Yeah, so this is very common that teams may start out aligned and over time they drift apart. And even good teams will check in. A good team might check in at the beginning, make sure everyone is on the same page, and then like, okay, team, go. But they're not fully aligned, because it's almost rare. It's a rare thing that anyone's going to be fully aligned with someone else. And over time it drifts. And it's amazing that they don't then check in till right before the deadline, or 10% time left. And now we realized, oh shit, like we are not on the same page. And we've been drifting. We thought we're headed in the same general direction, but we're not going to land on the same island together, actually, at the same time. And so you have to be constantly tacking. Like, you have to be constantly checking in to ensure that you're staying in the right direction. And that's this end game thinking of like, you've set a clear end point. You have a deadline that's an end in time, and you have an end vision where you're trying to head. But then you're always having to constantly check in, calibrate. And the only way you can do that is by sharing at 3/4 baked moments throughout the process and retacking. And it's all in service of trying to be aligned fully with others that you're working on. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. On that note too, with just working in teams like this and getting to a finished product, how do you bring teams along to this three-fourths baked idea when most teams are probably striving for perfection?
It's challenging because you're culturally often swimming upstream where people are not wired to do this kind of thinking. But then they don't understand, like, well, how come it didn't turn out great? Or how come we didn't get much done? And it's like, okay, guys, like, it's a different approach. Let's try this. And when they do, and you work with people enough, some people get it. And once they get it, it's like, oh my God, now I get it. And they have this shift. And that's really it's why I wrote the book, because I want more great ideas out in the world. I want more people that I care about to be successful. I want people to innovate more and not get in their own way and get frustrated and give up or whatever the case is. And that's why I wrote the book, because I think luckily I've learned, through lots of failures, a bunch of techniques that enable me to get a lot done in a short amount of time. But often there's friction. My approach, sometimes people that first work with me, they're like, what the hell is this guy doing? And this is uncomfortable. Those that stick around long enough see where I'm going in the end. So
You have a chapter called Becoming a Trim Tab, and it's based on a tiny rudder that turns the big rudder on the ship. And you mentioned that while not everyone can be the CEO, big rudder, anyone can be a trim tab. Can you give an example of how an individual contributor can act as a trim tab to shift the direction of a massive organization, probably with a lot of bureaucracy?
yeah, there's a couple things that I'll say quickly. First of all, everyone has agency on some level over their lives and the work that they do, and certainly some people have more agency than others. It's easier to turn a ship around if you're the CEO than if you're a middle manager, and certainly from a fresh recruit out of college, it's harder still. But people need to remember that they do have agency, and not to give up if they're not the rudder, like not to give up if they're like, and a lot of people do, as you know, people like, well, I'm never going to like change this. It's like, I'm never going to have a say in this. And I think that's unfortunate, because there are examples of people that have changed big things by applying the leverage that they do. When you do excellent work, it is a form of leverage on the people around you. You can elevate a team, you can elevate a group within a team. You can do this by practicing some of these techniques, and what it does is it builds trust, and you can then share the credit if you want for a whole group, and that group can then apply leverage with their agency within an organization. I've seen it change the culture of companies and organizations, and on single projects it can happen. But again, it requires a willingness to fail. It requires a willingness to put ideas out into the world at a three-quarter baked moment, and then learn from them, and to keep at it and be persistent, and then that change can really happen.
We talk a lot about team dynamics on this show. You list several principles for the three-quarters big team, including the no assholes policy, which I love, and the art of bird dogging. Can you share what bird dogging is in this context and why it's actually a sign of high functioning teams rather than micromanagement?
Yeah, I just I'd never heard the word bird dogging until I moved to the States. I'm Canadian, and I moved, and I was actually in Oregon, and someone talked about bird dogging, and I thought it was kind of a funny metaphor, but I've adopted it. And it speaks to the need to be highly communicative with the people that you're working with, and to follow up and check in. Don't make assumptions. We've all heard that. Like, don't assume, or makes an ass out of you and me, as people talk about. But it's different than micromanaging, because the flip side of this is talk about is, it isn't good to micromanage people. You got to let people try things, which is totally true, but that's different than checking in and making sure that that alignment we talked about earlier is actually happening. And bird dogging for me is a principle of caring enough about your work and caring enough about your colleagues to check in early and often to say, how's it going? Can I help? How are things going relative to the deadline and relative to the mission of what we're trying to accomplish? And if it's not going well, doing that alignment shift that we talked about. And the moment you find out, like, yeah, we're still aligned, great, you disappear, you don't micromanage because you've got other things to do. So it's not in any way, bird dogging for me is not about micromanaging. It's about caring enough to be engaged through the process and finding out.
Yeah, I love that because it does feel like it's like the approach and the language that you use is the difference between bird dogging and micromanagement.
Yeah, for me it is anyway.
Yeah, maybe not to some. As we, most organizations nowadays are navigating hybrid work, and in the book you highlight this communication hierarchy pyramid, and at the bottom is face to face, and at the very top, the least effective is text and email. You mentioned that we are drowning in information and starving for knowledge. So, for leaders who are listening, how do we structure our communication policies to make sure we're not adding to noise?
Well, you always need to communicate more than you think you do, if you're a leader. And I do advise people for anything important is best left for in-person dialogue, or when you can see somebody. You don't always have that luxury. Certainly, I've fallen into the trap myself on more than one occasion of sending an email and regretting sending the email because it should have been talked about. But you have to share as much as you can. Now, that doesn't mean death by meetings either. So the other flip side of this is finding that balance of when do you need to communicate with an entire group, when you need to get people together, when, how do you run things very efficiently. And the difference really depends on your relationship with the person, frankly, your familiarity with how they think and how they do their work. For some people, check-ins can be really quick. They can be 30-second check-ins. They can be 5-minute check-ins. Other people might need a half hour. They might need an hour. And your willingness as a leader to understand that difference is really, really important here. Never have an unessential meeting. Have an agenda for the meetings you do have. Calibrate your meetings to the familiarity of the people that you're meeting with, and be willing to do it.
Jason, I got to the end of your book. I read the conclusion, and then I flipped to the next page, and there's a sequel to the conclusion. Not many books have that. That was pretty fun. But in that sequel, I thought it was interesting. You write about developing an inner compass and good judgment that guides us. You say that isn't something we're born with, rather than it's cultivated through the fires of trial and error.
Correct.
Hard work applied objectively to harness talent. So if our listeners want to start calibrating that compass today, what is one challenge that you would issue to them right now to get started?
I would tell people to get comfortable with failure, to make failure your friend, like that Bucky Fuller story. Not that you always have to love failing, that's not what I mean, but especially earlier in your career, share ideas as often as you can, ask for feedback, ask for mentorship, ask for feedback from people that will actually give you real feedback and not just tell you what you want to hear, and then learn from that. You don't have to make the same mistake twice. You can make a different mistake, and each time you're getting better at what you're doing, and you're beginning to calibrate your inner compass. And you do this enough, you have your own internal bullshit meter. It's much better to have an honest understanding of what your actual limitations are, and not what someone else thinks your limitations are, and your own ego on the one hand, or being overly critical of yourself on the other hand, insecurities on the other hand. And that's a valuable thing to have in life and in business, is that sort of honest assessor internally.
Jason, this has been a fun discussion. The book is The Magic of Imperfection, the 3/4 baked secret to unlocking innovation and getting more done. I think you said this is your 8th book, right? So you got so much other work out there that people should check out. Any other things you want to point out, highlight, any upcoming events, anything like that you want to share with listeners?
Well, in the spirit of my book, I'm eager to get people's feedback on what works from their perspective, after they've read the book, what resonated, what didn't. I'd love to hear from people. So I'm easy to find, and hope people enjoy the book, and I hope it helps them.
My guest today has been Jason F. McClennan. Jason, thanks for coming on.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.